welcome back to my series on opening theory. And this video, I'm going to do something a bit different, a bit exciting, as this game is actually going to be kind of talking about 3 openings simultaneously. So what this video is about is it's about the King's Indian attack and why it does not work against the Petrov or against Aлекhine's defense. And so this video is relevant to all 3 of those openings. So if you are not aware, the King's Indian attack can be played with a knight f3 move order, but it can also be used in e4 openings. For example, against the French, what the King's Indian attack involves is, like, you can tell your opponent's playing a King's Indian attack when you see this move d3, and then here white plays knight d2, like this is a French, in order to take back on e4 or with the pawn without having to worry about annoying queen trades, like that. Like, so after takes, queen takes queen, don't have to worry about that. That's why knight d2 is played in this particular, like against the French, in this particular position. And then the idea is that white is going to fianchetto with the bishop on g2, develop the other knight to f3, and castle kingside. And for black, what black would really like to do is to play the move e5. However, black has already played the move e6, since this is a French. And so if black played the move e5, it would be kind of like black has just wasted some time in the opening, and that's generally not so good. But that idea is key to understanding why the King's Indian attack, while it might work against the French, the Sicilian, and maybe even the Caro-Kann, does not actually match up so well against Aлекhine's defense or against the Petrov. So, for this game that I'm going to be looking at today, it is a game from the late 80s. But even though it is from the late 80s, it is still of great theoretical value. With the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Miodrag Todorcevic. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is a grandmaster, I believe, I think he was born in Serbia, and then he moved to France, and if I'm not mistaken, and he might have later moved to Spain, and he is a grandmaster from generations past. Like, both of these players, they are currently in their early 80s right now, so they're 80 years old. So there isn't that much I can find about them besides, what's on their Wikipedia page and other stuff. Though, as with the previous video, there might be information about them in other languages. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Vlatko Kovacevic. I'm probably severely butchering both players' names, and he was a grandmaster who first represented Yugoslavia, back when that was a country, and later represented Croatia. And both of these players, they represented their countries in, like, multiple times in the chess olympiad. But this particular game was not an olympiad game. It was played at the Vidmar Memorial, which is a tournament named in honor of the Slovenian grandmaster Milan Vidmar. And I think this tournament actually is still held to this day. I'm not so sure. I think the last time it was held was 2016. But more information about these players and about this tournament will be in the video description. So for this particular game, what black played was Aлекhine's defense. And then on move 2, white played d3. Now in the actual game, black played the move d5 here. However, this is not an optimal move order in my opinion. So for our purposes, I have changed the move order. The reason why d5 is not optimal is that white still has the option to play e5. Like, white can do this. In fact, against Aлекhine's defense, playing e5 is best for white. Right, like on move 2. So like, what I mean is, over here, playing e5 is best. But anyway, in the actual game, black played d5, but that's not so good since white could still play e5, and that actually is a very playable line. Right, so when white plays d3, that's a very timid move. What black should do, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the engine, is just play the immediate e5 and be like, okay, you're not going to take the center? Fine, I will put a pawn here instead. And then, let's see what happened next. We've kind of changed the move order a little bit, but it makes sense for white to play knight f3, attack the pawn. And you might remember that I said that this game is of theoretical value to the Petrov defense. Well, as you can see, this position over here, it's kind of like you have a Petrov, except on move 3, for whatever reason, white chose to play the move d3. So the next logical move for black is to just defend the pawn. Like, this is very simple, straightforward chess so far. And then you know that you're dealing with a King's Indian attack if white plays the move g3. As basically the King's Indian attack is kind of like you're playing a King's Indian defense, but with the white pieces. So you're going to put your bishop on g2 and then castle kingside, and then maybe launch a kingside attack. Maybe eventually play f4, e5, or maybe f4, f5, that kind of stuff. But anyway, next move for black is to play d5, challenging the center. Like, very logical play. Okay. And then here in this particular game, white played the move knight b d2, which the engine really does not like, or rather the engine considers inaccurate. Like, it's actually best for white to just take this pawn right away. And after, say, queen takes d5, for example, knight c3, bishop b4, it's kind of like we have a Philidor defense, but with the colors reversed, and where, you know, the opponent has made the extra move g6 for whatever reason. Like, this is kind of like a reverse Philidor, and this is a pretty pleasant position for black here. I might do another video that covers a game that features this line, but for now, this video is about the King's Indian attack. So white plays the move knight b d2 because white wants to be able to take back on e4 with the pawn, and also the pawn is attacked twice by black's knight and by black's pawn, so it makes sense to defend it. And here in this position, it's best for black to take on e4 right away. It's best to just take right away because white has to take back with the pawn. If white instead takes back with the knight, then you're very happy to make this trade and do that trade on d1, as I've mentioned before. And then black just has a very nasty initiative, just developing with tempo. Let's bring another piece out, attack that pawn on f2, this guy. And then this guy has to drop back. And then maybe we drop the bishop back. And then white would have to play f3 because there isn't really any nice way to defend that pawn. Let's see. Then black could just play knight d4. And then go after this position over here. This is just very nice for black. Like, black has all their pieces out, black has castle, black has a safer king, whereas most of white's pieces are on the first rank, so this would be terrible. So that is why in this position it's best for white to just take back with the pawn. And that is good. It's good for black to force white to take back with the pawn, and the reason why is because of this bishop. Like, white has already kind of committed to putting the bishop on g2, because if white moves the bishop elsewhere, like to any of these squares, then black can just put their bishop over here and stop white from castling kingside, thwarting white's plans. That's very unpleasant. Like, generally, when you can stop your opponent from castling, you should usually do so. Oh, and so since white has taken back on e4 like this, when white puts the bishop on g2, it's going to be a pretty unhappy bishop. It's just going to be staring at a pawn's butt for a while. So that is why it's good for black to do this. That is a good way to kind of disrupt white's piece coordination. And so anyway, I think we have now more or less caught up with the game's move order after bishop c5. This move is very sensible. It's a very good square for the bishop, probably in fact the best square for the dark squared bishop. Like, it puts some pressure on the f2 pawn, but also after white castles, the bishop will be pinning this pawn to the king, so that can be very annoying. Especially if we later attack the pawn with knight g4 and force the rook away. And we'll kind of see later how black can do that. So after bishop g2, as expected, we have castle, and then castles. And then in this position, we're now fully caught up with the move order. Black plays the move a5, and this is a good move. Like, it kind of looks a bit weird, but it actually has many ideas. One idea is to control the b4 square so that it is more difficult for white to kick black's bishop away. And another idea is that black might later play the move b6 and bring the bishop to a6, where it can attack the rook on f1, forcing it away from defending the pawn on f2, and that might be very annoying for white to deal with. So white played the move a4, which is not a bad move. It stops black from playing a4, but it also doesn't really do a whole lot. Like, maybe there are some better moves that white could have played. And then black just made another good developing move, the move queen e7. Now, one other thing that's good about the pawn trade about like on e4 is that black will usually get to the d file first and be able to put the rook there and basically annoy white's queen. And one thing I forgot to mention about when we put the bishop on a6 is that if white's queen is on e2, then it would be attacking the a6 square. But if we play a5, then the rook actually supports the bishop moving to a6, and we would be threatening to kind of skewer the queen and rook. And so anyway, in this position over here, black played the move queen e7, which both protects the e5 pawn and c5 bishop. So that's good. It's not good to have loose pieces or pawns. That frees up the knight on c6 to maybe move to d4 eventually if it wants, or move somewhere else from where it is. As it's currently not doing that much. And this move also allows the rook to come to d8, which is also very good. So generally, these kinds of multi-purpose developing moves are ones that are, they are among the best moves. I forget it was who said it, but I think it was Capablanca who once said that his moves are very strong because each one of them actually does two things. It doesn't just do one thing. But anyway, in this position, white played the move c3, and the engine actually considers to be a pretty serious inaccuracy, but it's actually pretty hard to find good moves for white. Like, the idea of c3 is, pretty reasonable, pretty logical. Like, it might be to eventually play b4, it might be to play queen b3, like develop the queen, maybe to b3 or to c2. But overall, it was not white's best move. In fact, white probably has to play very accurately just to stay in the game. Like, according to the engine, the best move for white is the move knight b3, but black is still doing very well. In fact, in this position, if black really wants to, black can take the pawn on e4, although this is not the best line, since white has queen d5, and then black could make this trade on f2, and then white should take, because otherwise black will play knight f6 and then save the bishop. So then after this trade, like, this is actually perfectly reasonable for black. Like, the trade's not bad. Black is slightly better, but this is not the best line, even though this is fairly interesting. The best line is to just develop more pieces and play for activity. So after rook d8, queen into e2, just play b6, and what's funny is that even though white can take and black's pawn structure looks awful, black will actually eventually improve this pawn structure. So after a move like, say, rook e1, since maybe black is going to play bishop a6, which would force white to play the pawn move c4, which is not so good, as it just makes the knight outposts on d4 and b4 very strong. Like in this position, black will play knight d4 and just have a ridiculous amount of pressure on white's position, like so many moves, so many threats, which would basically force white to take. You go over here, like force this trade, and then after c takes d4, black is very happy. Like, black just has a much better bishop than white's bishop, and black's control of the center is very good. Black's pawn on on d4 is very strong. So even if white had played knight b3 in this position, black would be doing just fine. Black would have a very pleasant position to play with. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, in this position, white made the inaccurate move c3. And then here, black played the move rook d8. Very logical move, developing the rook, but also threatening the pawn on e4, as the knight on d2 is pinned to the queen. So black is threatening knight takes e4. So white played the move knight h4, defending the pawn using the bishop. And then here, black played g6, which normally is a move you wouldn't want to make, since it does weaken the dark squares around the king. However, white cannot easily get to those dark squares, since this knight is in the way of white's bishop, and white would take at least 2 moves in order to, move that knight. Right, and basically, black played g6 in order to stop the knight from coming to the f5 square, which is a common idea in the King's Indian. Like, mainly the King's Indian defense, but also sometimes the King's Indian attack. And one thing that's great about the bishop on c5 right now is that white cannot play the move f4, as the bishop is pinning it to the king. So the knight h4 maneuver has kind of lost some of its bite. And now, if it were black's move, black would probably play either bishop g4, like just developing the bishop with tempo, or the move knight g4 to attack this pawn and maybe play b6 and bishop a6 later on to harass the rook a bit, and to kind of make white waste time playing c4 maybe. But anyway, in this position, white did not want black putting things on g4, so white played the move h3, which makes sense, and then black just played b6, which also makes sense, like going for that bishop a6 idea. And then in this position, it's actually very hard to find a good move for white. Like, according to the engine, the best move for white is to play king h2. Like, this is really funny. And then after bishop a6, white cannot currently play the move c4 because the knight is pinned to the queen, so black could just take on c4. So the best move now for white would be rook h1, which is a very silly place to be putting the rook, and the reason why is because after, like, if the rook went to g1 or to e1, then the move bishop takes f2 would just attack the rook and force it to move again, so that's why rook h1 is best. And we can already see here that white's position would just be falling apart. This is just no fun for white, right, at all. But that is not what happened in the game, even though that is the best line according to the engine. What actually happened in the game is white played the move rook e1, which is, you know, a pretty logical move. And now here black played a very nice move, very strong move, rook d3, threatening the pawn on g3, since remember the pawn on f2 is pinned. And so it's very hard to find a good move for white here, since like king h1 or king h2 would just drop the f2 pawn, and king f1 runs into bishop a6. So white really has trouble finding any good options. Like, that's just very unpleasant. So white was like, okay, I will defend that pawn on g3 with the move knight hf3, and well, this move actually loses the game. So if you want, you can now pause the video and see if you can find the move that black played here. Like, basically the game went on for two more moves, and then white resigned. Alright, now keep in mind that these are grandmasters, so like basically white resigned because black's advantage was so overwhelmingly crushing that white basically felt that they would not be able to recover. But if you want, you can now pause the video and see if you can find the move that black played in this position. Like, see if you can find the next two moves. Okay, I think that's enough time to pause the video. I will now show the move. So first black played bishop takes f2 check, and then clearly white has to take back, because otherwise black will just be up in exchange, and that would be a winning advantage. That would be enough for, you know, black to win. That would be resignable. Well, like, especially if we're talking about grandmasters, like being up in exchange and a pawn with no real compensation for the opponent is very good. So then white took back, very logical, and then the next move was queen c5 check. And here in this position, white resigned. And the reason why white resigned is because black's attack on white is just so crushing. According to the engine, the best move for white is to play knight d4, after which black should just take with the knight. Like, you know, an attack is good when, and basically the engine is saying that the defending side has to give back the material. And then according to the engine, the best move is b4, and then takes, queen takes, and then black is just up 2 pawns, and white has no compensation for the 2 pawns. In fact, white's pieces are terrible, whereas black's pieces are awesome. Like, even this rook who's sitting on a8 is now awesome because he's, you know, putting pressure on the a4 pawn. So this is the best move according to the engine, is to just give back the material. One thing that is worth noting is that here it's best for black to take with the knight as opposed to the pawn, as we want to keep this diagonal open if possible, like keep up this pressure on the king. And it's also interesting to look at some other lines, like the move king f1 is actually quite funny how black deals with this. Black basically plays knight g5, threatening knight takes g3 checkmate. And that is a very annoying threat for white to deal with. It is just very unpleasant, and obviously bishop h1 doesn't work because just take with the bishop, and it will be checkmate very soon. Like Black's king, he is surrounded by all his pieces, but they're all useless. It's like they're sleeping or something. The poor king. So that's what would happen in the king f1 line. And then in the king e2 line, like here, what Black could now do, like Black could go for knight h5, although that runs into, like, maybe White could play knight f1 and give up the queen or something. Although actually no, what am I saying? White is attacking Black's rook. So here it's best to defend your rook and threaten some nasty discovered checks. Next, and then after c4, White is still attacking the rook. So then you just develop your final rook, and this is just crushing. This is just an overwhelming amount of pressure. Like, White is probably not going to survive this. Like, even though White might have an extra bishop, what is that extra bishop really doing? It's sitting on the couch eating potato chips. And yeah, this is just crushing. Like, according to the engine, like, next two moves is just this, and White cannot take on c4 because the knight is pinned, and yeah, that's just curtains. But anyway, this was the final position of the game, so I'll just go back to that. And this is an excellent game. It's only 15 moves long, but I think it does a very good job of convincing me why the King's Indian attack does not do very well against Aлекhine's defense or the Petrov. Why, you know, the opening books on the King's Indian attack, they'll cover the French defense, they'll cover the Sicilian, they'll cover the Caro-Kann, but they won't talk about Aлекhine's defense and the Petrov. They won't have chapters on them. And it's like, now we know why. So just to review very quickly, in the Aлекhine's defense case, very important to play e5 right away. Like, don't let White change their mind and play e5 themselves. And then here, like if we're in a Petrov, just play knight c6 to defend the pawn. And then if White just goes for the King's Indian attack plan, just play d5 and just immediately take. Like, if White doesn't go for a reversed Philidor, then don't let White change their mind. Just take, and then, you know, play bishop c5, control this diagonal. That's very important. Castle, castle, and then of course just remember the, you know, piece coordination and development scheme. So this idea a5 is very nice, and then this idea queen e7 followed by rook d8 is very nice, and then yeah, just rook d8, and you might have to remember this g6 idea, but maybe not, since bishop takes f5 is playable, like if White moves their knight a bunch of times. Although one issue with bishop takes f5 is it would improve this bishop. So yeah, g6 you might remember just from seeing that. And then the rest of the game, like your own games, might not happen in exactly the same way, but these are some very cool ideas. And finally we have the sack, and we are back at the final position. So I hope that you enjoyed this game. As usual, if you enjoyed what you saw, feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you, and goodbye for now.